What if your boss was watching you, without you even knowing? One waitress thought she was just doing the right thing when she paid for a homeless veteran's meal out of her own pocket. But what happened next? No one saw it coming, and it changed everything. David Langston adjusted the brim of his worn baseball cap as he stepped into the bustling Langston dining location in Brooklyn. The aroma of sizzling steaks and freshly baked bread filled the air, mingling with the faint hum of casual conversations and clinking silverware. It was a scene he had seen countless times before. Yet today, he was seeing it from a different perspective. For years, he had built Langston Dining into a household name, a chain known for quality meals and efficient service. But lately, complaints had surfaced, whispers of robotic service, of employees prioritizing rules over humanity. If he wanted to understand the truth, he needed to step out of his corner office and into the heart of his business. Dressed in faded jeans and a nondescript jacket, David blended in seamlessly. No one gave him a second glance as he found a table near the window. He picked up the menu, pretending to study it, but his real focus was on the staff. Near the register, a young waitress caught his attention. She was in her mid-20s, with dark hair pulled into a ponytail and an air of quiet determination. Her name tag read Emily. She moved quickly, balancing plates and refilling drinks while offering customers a polite smile. There was no sign of indifference or carelessness in her demeanor, but something about her eyes told David she was carrying more than just trays. Then, the door chimed. A man stepped inside, pausing just past the entrance. His clothes were worn, his boots scuffed, and his salt and pepper beard was neatly trimmed but unkempt at the edges. He hesitated before approaching the counter, his gaze scanning the menu above, lingering a little too long. David had seen that look before. The quiet calculation of someone trying to figure out what they could afford rather than what they actually wanted. Emily noticed too. Her smile softened as she approached him. "What can I get for you today?" The man, Jack, cleared his throat. "Just a coffee, please." David watched as Emily nodded and keyed in the order. But instead of stepping away, she leaned in slightly. "Are you sure? The soup's fresh today. A good warm meal." Jack hesitated, then shook his head. "I appreciate it, but I'm fine." Emily didn't push, but as she walked away, David noticed her reach into the pocket of her apron. A quick movement, subtle enough that no one else seemed to notice. But David caught it. Then, a different presence disrupted the moment. Michael, a shift manager in his early 40s, stood nearby, arms crossed. His pressed uniform and stiff posture radiated disapproval. He glanced at Jack, then at Emily. A flicker of irritation passed over his face before he turned away. Something was off. David pretended to sip his water while keeping his focus on Emily. A few minutes later, she returned with a tray. A steaming bowl of soup, a fresh roll, and a small plate of fruit sat beside the coffee Jack had ordered. Jack blinked. "Miss, I didn't." Emily cut in with a quiet smile. "It's taken care of." David caught the slight motion. Emily slipping a few bills from her pocket onto the tray before walking away. It wasn't the restaurant covering the meal. She had paid for it herself. A simple act of kindness. Yet, based on Michael's expression from earlier, it was something that wasn't exactly encouraged here. David leaned back in his chair, his appetite forgotten. He had come to observe, to understand what was happening in his company. What he had just witnessed told him more than any report ever could. Emily barely had time to step away before she felt a presence looming behind her. The weight of an unspoken warning pressed down before she even turned around. Michael stood there, arms crossed, his expression carved from stone. "Emily," he said, voice low enough that only she could hear. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" She swallowed but didn't look away. "Just making sure a customer is taken care of." Michael's lips pressed into a thin line. "That's not your decision to make. We have policies for a reason." Emily glanced at Jack, who was staring down at the bowl of soup in front of him, fingers lightly tracing the rim of the spoon. He hadn't touched the food yet, as if still deciding whether he had the right to accept it. "If someone is hungry," Emily said, her voice firmer now, "I think we should help." Michael exhaled sharply through his nose, his annoyance palpable. "That's not how this works. You can't just hand out food whenever you feel like it. If you do this again, there will be consequences." Emily clenched her fists but nodded. She knew arguing wouldn't change his mind. At least not now. From across the room, David continued to observe. His hands rested loosely on the table, his drink untouched. He had been in boardrooms where millions of dollars were at stake. Had seen executives maneuver through negotiations with barely a flicker of emotion. Yet, what he was witnessing here, a simple exchange between a waitress and her manager, somehow felt more telling than any business deal. A passing busboy slowed near his table, refilling a nearby glass of water. David seized the moment. "That girl," he said quietly, nodding toward Emily. "She always this kind to customers?" The busboy hesitated, looking toward her before answering. "Emily? Yeah, she's one of the good ones. But she gets in trouble a lot for stuff like this." David arched a brow. "Helping people? Yeah, she's been warned before. Last time, it was an old lady who didn't have enough for her meal." Emily covered the difference. "Management wasn't happy about it." David nodded, filing away the information. At the counter, Jack finally picked up his spoon, hesitantly taking the first sip of the soup. His shoulders relaxed slightly. A quiet sigh escaped him, almost imperceptible, but David caught it. Jack glanced up at Emily, who had returned to check on him. "I don't know how to thank you," he admitted. "You don't have to," she assured him. Jack hesitated, then spoke more softly. "I used to be in the service. After I got out, things didn't line up the way I thought they would. Jobs dried up, savings ran out. Now, I just get by." Emily nodded, listening without judgment. "Some days are better than others," Jack admitted, stirring his soup. "Today wasn't one of them. Until now." Emily offered a small smile. "Everyone deserves a break sometimes." Before Jack could respond, a sharp voice cut through the air. "Emily, my office, now." Michael stood by the hallway leading to the back offices, arms crossed, jaw tight. A murmur rippled through the restaurant. A few employees exchanged wary glances. Even Jack stiffened, his hand pausing mid-air. Emily cast one last reassuring look at him before squaring her shoulders and heading toward Michael. David's fingers drummed against the table. He had already seen enough. But this wasn't something he could ignore. As Emily disappeared down the hallway, he quietly stood and followed. She wasn't going to face this alone. The office was smaller than David expected, with a desk that looked like it had seen better days and a single window facing the alley behind the restaurant. Fluorescent lights flickered faintly, casting a sterile glow over the room. Emily stood in the middle, shoulders squared but hands clenched at her sides, as Michael and Linda sat across from her. Linda, the senior manager of this branch, leaned back in her chair, arms folded. She was in her mid-50s, with short cropped hair and a sharp gaze that missed nothing. Michael, standing just to her right, had his usual air of barely contained impatience. "You've been warned before, Emily," Linda said, her tone firm but controlled. "This company has policies for a reason. We don't give away food for free. If customers can't pay, they don't eat. It's that simple." Emily took a slow breath. "I didn't take food from the restaurant's inventory. I used my own money." Michael scoffed, crossing his arms. "That's not the point. If we allow employees to start making exceptions, where does it stop? Next thing you know, every worker here will be handing out meals on a whim. We have a business to run." Emily met his stare without flinching. "Jack wasn't looking for a handout. He was hungry, and I had the means to help. He served this country, and he deserved more than just a cup of coffee." Linda sighed and picked up a blank incident report from her desk. "Write up a statement explaining your actions. If this happens again, we'll have no choice but to suspend you." A knock on the door interrupted the tension. David stepped in, moving with the ease of someone who belonged in any room he entered. His expression was neutral, but his eyes held a quiet authority. "Excuse me," he said smoothly. "I was here earlier, and I saw what happened. I'd like to understand why a server showing basic human decency is considered a violation." Michael's frown deepened. "And you are?" "Just a customer," David said, keeping his voice even. "One who saw an employee go out of her way to help someone in need. And now, she's in trouble for it?" Linda straightened, studying him carefully. "Sir, we have rules in place for a reason. If employees start deciding who gets free meals, it could lead to problems." David tilted his head slightly. "What kind of problems?" People taking advantage? Or the restaurant losing a couple of dollars on food that would otherwise be thrown away? Michael exhaled sharply, pushing off the desk. This is a business. If we start giving away food, word gets around. Suddenly, we have people expecting handouts. David didn't react immediately. Instead, he turned his attention to Emily. Did you use company money? No, she said without hesitation. I paid for it myself. He nodded. So the restaurant didn't lose anything. Linda tapped her fingers on the desk, clearly growing frustrated. It's not about the money. It's about setting a precedent. We have policies, and employees need to follow them. David leaned slightly against the doorframe, his expression unreadable. Let me ask you something. How much food does this restaurant throw away at the end of the day? Linda hesitated, and Michael's jaw tightened. Neither answered. David let the silence hang before continuing. I've been in the food industry a long time. I know how much waste happens. Perfectly good meals tossed out while people like Jack go hungry. Wouldn't it make more sense to have a policy that allows employees to help? Within reason? Linda shifted in her chair. That's not how our system works. Michael, however, was less patient. Look, I don't know what you think you know. But you're just a customer. You don't run a restaurant. We have costs to consider. Margins to protect. David held his gaze, unblinking. You're right. I don't run a restaurant. I run a company. And I know that a business doesn't just run on numbers, it runs on people. Something flickered in Michael's expression. It wasn't just frustration. There was something else there, something guarded. David made a mental note of it. Linda exhaled and looked at Emily again. Just write the report. We'll discuss next steps later. Emily's hands clenched at her sides. David watched as she struggled with whether to comply or push back. He had seen enough. This wasn't just about a policy. There was more going on beneath the surface. And he intended to find out exactly what. David lingered near the counter after leaving the office, casually observing as employees moved through their evening routines. Beneath the surface of efficiency, there was tension, something unspoken. Employees took cautious glances toward the back office where Emily had just been reprimanded. No one said a word about it, but their silence spoke volumes. He approached a young man near the drink station, a line cook on break, fiddling with the cap of his water bottle. David leaned slightly closer, keeping his tone light. Michael seems like a strict one, he said. The cook hesitated, eyes darting around before responding. Yeah, you could say that. He twisted the bottle cap. He's big on numbers, keeps things efficient, but that usually means cutting corners. David nodded, encouraging him to continue. You work here long? Few months, the cook replied. Long enough to see how things changed after he took over. David arched a brow. Changed how? The cook glanced at the door again, lowering his voice. Before Michael, we used to donate extra food at the end of the night. It wasn't official policy or anything, but the old manager allowed it. You know, instead of dumping perfectly good meals in the trash. He shook his head. Michael shut that down real quick. Said it was bad for business. Now, if there's excess food, it goes straight to the dumpster. David's jaw tightened. And no one questioned it? The cook gave a humorless chuckle. Not unless they wanted to lose their job. David thanked him and moved away, his mind working through what he had just learned. Michael wasn't just enforcing policy, he was making decisions that actively hurt both employees and the community. And if he was this strict about food waste, what else was he manipulating? Meanwhile, in the break room, Emily sat on the edge of a plastic chair, twisting her fingers together. Her stomach was tight with unease. The threat of suspension hung over her, and she knew Michael would be watching her closely from now on. Just apologize. A fellow server, Maddie, said softly beside her. Say you won't do it again. Keep your head down. It's not worth losing your job over. Emily exhaled slowly. I can't pretend what I did was wrong. Maddie bit her lip. Then be careful. You know how Michael is. He has Linda on his side, and she doesn't go against him. Emily nodded, appreciating the concern, but her mind was made up. If helping someone in need meant risking her job, then so be it. Later that evening, David found Jack sitting on a worn bench near the restaurant's parking lot, sipping what was left of his coffee. He looked up as David approached. Didn't take you for the chatty type, Jack said, offering a tired smile. David sat beside him. Figured I owed you a conversation after watching what happened inside. Jack took another sip, letting the warmth settle. Not the first time I've been shown the door at a place like this. But it was the first time someone stood up for me. David studied him for a moment. You come here often? Jack chuckled, shaking his head. I move around. Try not to be in one place too long. People start noticing, and not in a good way. David hesitated before asking, what did you do before all this? Jack set his cup down. Served in the army. Did my time. Came back. And realized the world didn't have much use for me anymore. His voice was matter of fact. Not bitter. Tried to find work. But things don't always go the way you plan. One bad turn leads to another. And suddenly you're just getting by. David felt a twinge of frustration, not at Jack, but at a system that let people like him slip through the cracks. Jack rubbed his hands together. Funny thing is, this place used to be better about helping folks out. A while back, they had a system. Let employees set aside meals that weren't sold at the end of the day. Make sure they went to people who needed them. Nothing official, just something decent. He shook his head. That stopped about a year ago. Manager told me the new guy in charge didn't like the optics of it. Said it encouraged loitering. David's jaw tensed. Michael. Jack shrugged. Didn't get his name. But yeah, sounds about right. David sat in silence for a moment. He had suspected Michael was cutting costs in questionable ways. But now he had confirmation. The food waste policy wasn't just about efficiency, it was deliberate. And if Michael was willing to shut down something as harmless as food donations, what else had he changed? He exhaled. Decision made. It was time to stop watching from the sidelines. Tomorrow, he would reveal who he was. Not just to protect Emily, but to dig deeper into the cracks forming in his company. Something was wrong in Langston Dining, and he intended to fix it. The morning air outside the restaurant was crisp, but inside, the tension hung thick. Employees shuffled into the dining area, some whispering amongst themselves, others avoiding eye contact. A meeting this early was unusual, and no one was quite sure what to expect. Michael stood near the front, arms crossed, a smirk barely concealed on his face. To him, this was routine. Another employee stepping out of line. Another example to be made. Linda, positioned beside him, adjusted her blazer and scanned the room. Her expression unreadable. Emily sat toward the back, hands clasped tightly in her lap. She had spent most of the night replaying yesterday's events, weighing her options. She had no regrets about what she had done. But the reality of losing her job loomed over her. Maddie, sitting beside her, gave her a small nudge. Whatever happens, Maddie whispered, you did the right thing. Before Emily could respond, Linda cleared her throat, calling the meeting to order. As you all know, she began, we have policies in place to ensure that our restaurant runs efficiently and fairly. Unfortunately, an incident occurred yesterday that directly violated company guidelines. Michael shot Emily a quick glance, satisfied to see her stiffen. Linda continued, it's important that we remain consistent with our standards. We cannot allow individual employees to make unilateral decisions regarding store resources. Effective immediately. David rose from his seat. The movement was subtle, but the effect was immediate. The murmurs ceased. Linda paused, startled. Even Michael's smirk faltered. I think we should discuss that incident a little more, David said evenly. Linda blinked, momentarily thrown off. Sir, this is an internal company meeting. Yes, and I believe I have a say in company matters. Michael scoffed. And why exactly should we care what you think? David met his gaze, then slowly turned to the employees. My name is David Langston. I own this company. Silence. A few employees exchanged confused glances. Others straightened in their seats, eyes widening. Linda's mouth opened slightly, as if forming a rebuttal. But nothing came out. Michael, meanwhile, paled visibly. David let the weight of his words settle before continuing. For the past few days, I've been observing how this location is run. I've seen employees work hard. I've also seen decisions that go against the values this company was built on. He shifted his attention toward Linda and Michael. So now, I'm asking, why is it that an act of kindness is being treated as a violation? Michael cleared his throat, forcing his expression back into neutrality. With all due respect, Mr. Langston, this isn't about kindness. This is about structure. If we allow one employee to hand out food, what stops the next one? Rules exist for a reason. David nodded slowly. That's true. Rules do exist for a reason. But so does judgment, so does integrity, and so does responsibility. Would you like to explain why this restaurant throws away perfectly good food every night instead of using it to help people in need? Linda visibly tensed. Michael's jaw twitched. David pressed on. I've spoken to employees. I've spoken to customers. I've spoken to Jack. He gestured toward the back of the room, where Jack, though hesitant, had accepted David's invitation to attend. And you know what I've learned? This restaurant used to have a system in place to donate food. A system that disappeared the moment Michael was promoted. A few gasps rippled through the room. Employees exchanged looks, some confused, some knowing. Michael straightened. That policy was removed to maintain order. We can't have people coming here expecting handouts. David's gaze darkened. So instead, we let food rot in dumpsters? Michael floundered for a response. But before he could speak, another voice chimed in. That's not the only thing he's stopped. A young employee, one of the newer hires, spoke up from the back. He looked nervous, but he continued. I suggested a food donation program a few months ago. Michael shut it down, said it wasn't profitable. Another voice followed. He's denied every request to donate leftovers, even when we had more than we needed. More murmurs. A growing wave of unease spread through the room. David turned back to Linda. And you approved these changes? Linda hesitated. Michael assured me it was for the company's best interest. David studied her carefully. There was uncertainty in her voice, something just beneath the surface. She wasn't the mastermind behind these decisions, but she had enabled them. He looked back to the employees. This stops today. A hush fell over the room. Effective immediately. Emily will not be fired. In fact, she will be promoted to assistant manager. Because we need leadership that understands the value of people, not just numbers. Emily's breath caught. A ripple of approval spread through the employees. David wasn't finished. Additionally, I am implementing a company-wide initiative. No more unnecessary food waste. Each location will partner with local organizations to donate surplus food. No more excuses. Scattered applause broke out. Employees who had been quiet now sat straighter, murmuring to one another. And as for Michael, David continued, shifting his focus. You're suspended. Effective immediately. There will be a full investigation into your managerial decisions. Michael's face turned a deep shade of red. You can't be serious. I am. David interrupted, voice firm. And you should be grateful I'm handling this professionally instead of just firing you outright. The weight of the moment sank in. Michael clenched his fists but said nothing. David exhaled, then turned toward the employees. I built this company on a foundation of integrity. Somewhere along the way, we lost sight of that. But today, we fix it. A moment of silence passed. Then, slowly, employees began to clap. As the applause grew, Linda remained quiet, her gaze averted. David noticed. There was more to this. Michael wasn't the only problem. And he intended to find out who else was pulling the strings. Michael stormed out of the meeting room, his face flushed with frustration. The humiliation of being publicly suspended gnawed at him. And the way the employees had reacted, some even clapping, made his blood boil. He needed to act fast before David Langston dug any deeper. He pushed open the door to Linda's office without knocking. She was sitting at her desk, fingers lightly tapping against a folder. Her expression unreadable. This is ridiculous. Michael spat. That man walks in here, makes a scene, and suddenly everything I've built is under fire? Linda sighed, closing the folder. You made yourself an easy target. The donation policy was unnecessary. You should have let it be. Michael scoffed. Oh, now you're acting like you weren't on board? Don't play dumb, Linda. We both know why we changed that policy. And if Langston keeps digging, he'll find out too. She exhaled sharply and stood, stepping closer to him. Keep your voice down. Michael ran a hand through his hair, trying to steady himself. We need to do something. He's not going to stop at just suspending me. Linda gave him a long look before murmuring. We still have leverage. Michael narrowed his eyes. What do you mean? She glanced at the door before lowering her voice. Let's just say there are things in motion that he doesn't know about yet. If he pushes too hard, he won't like what he finds. Michael felt a flicker of hope. So we're not done yet? Linda smirked slightly. Not even close. David sat in his temporary office at the restaurant, poring over spreadsheets. He had requested a full financial report on food waste and supply management across all Langston dining locations. Something about Michael's decisions didn't add up, and he was determined to figure out what. As he scanned the numbers, a pattern began to emerge. The reported amount of discarded food was inconsistent. In some cases, it exceeded expected waste levels, but no extra costs appeared in disposal expenses. If that food wasn't being thrown away, where was it going? David's thoughts were interrupted by a quiet knock. A young man entered hesitantly, shifting on his feet. He had the cautious look of someone debating whether speaking up was worth the risk. Mr. Langston, the man said, voice low, I think I have information you need. David gestured for him to sit. And you are? Jake. I used to work in the storage and inventory department before they transferred me to cleaning. David leaned forward. What do you know, Jake? Jake hesitated, then spoke quickly, as if getting it out before he lost his nerve. Not all of the wasted food is actually wasted. Some of it, large amounts, gets marked as discarded. But it's not being thrown out. David frowned. Where is it going? There's a company, Vanguard Supply. They pick up shipments late at night. After closing, I saw Michael oversee a few of them himself. But here's the thing. Those shipments never show up in the system. David's mind sharpened. So they're taking food meant to be discarded and selling it? Jake nodded. Yeah, and from what I overheard, it's not just this location. It's happening at others, too. David absorbed the information. This wasn't just about cutting costs. This was fraud. Someone was profiting off the manipulated numbers. Why are you telling me this? David asked. Jake swallowed hard. Because it's wrong, and I don't want to lose my job over someone else's greed. David nodded. You did the right thing, Jake. Jake exhaled in relief and stood to leave. Before walking out, he turned back. Be careful, sir. Michael isn't the only one involved. David wasted no time. He called for Michael to meet him privately. When Michael arrived, his confidence was noticeably shaken. David wasted no time in confronting him. I know about Vanguard Supply, David said evenly. Michael flinched but quickly recovered. I don't know what you're talking about. David placed a printed spreadsheet on the desk between them. Food marked as waste, yet no disposal costs. Deliveries made in the middle of the night to a private distributor. You want to try lying again? Michael's jaw clenched. For the first time, David saw something flicker behind his eyes, something beyond arrogance. Fear. I'll ask you one more time. David pressed. Who else is involved? Michael let out a slow exhale before smirking. You think you've got it all figured out, don't you? He leaned forward, lowering his voice. But you're missing something big. Langston, you really think I set this up on my own? David studied him. Michael wasn't scared of being caught. He was scared of whoever was pulling the strings. Michael straightened, still smirking. You won't like what happens next. That night, as David returned to his office, his phone buzzed with an email alert. The sender was anonymous. The message contained just one line. Stop now before it's too late. There are things you shouldn't uncover. David stared at the screen. This wasn't just about Michael anymore. This went deeper. David stared at the email on his screen, rereading the words as if expecting them to change. The message was short, almost impersonal, but the weight it carried was unmistakable. Stop now before it's too late. There are things you shouldn't uncover. He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin. The email had no sender name, no traceable address. Whoever sent it knew how to cover their tracks. This wasn't just a warning, it was a calculated move. Someone was watching him. He moved the cursor, hovering over the delete button, but stopped himself. Instead, he flagged the email and forwarded it to his private IT team. If there was even the slightest way to track the source, he wanted to find it. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. He turned to see Jake slipping into the room, glancing over his shoulder before shutting the door behind him. His usual nervous energy was even more pronounced tonight. Jake hesitated before speaking. I need to tell you something. David gestured for him to sit. Go on. Jake took a breath, as if bracing himself. There's more to the food shipments than what I told you before. David's gaze sharpened. Explain. Jake ran a hand through his hair. Voice low. I saw something a few weeks ago. Every time a shipment was marked as discarded, Michael would go to the back office before it left the building. A few minutes later, files would get shredded, not just routine paperwork, big stacks of them. David narrowed his eyes. You're sure? Jake nodded. I took out the trash once and saw it myself. Contracts, invoices, stuff that looked important. And there's one more thing. The night before he got suspended, he left for a meeting. He told people it was nothing. Just some paperwork. But I heard him say something about talking to corporate. David leaned forward. Do you know who he met with? Jake shook his head. No, but it wasn't just anyone. He looked nervous before he left. David considered this. If Michael had been answering to someone higher up, then his removal was only the beginning. Whoever was truly behind this was still out there. Jake hesitated before speaking again. There's one other thing. I don't know if it matters. But Linda, she's been acting different. David's expression didn't change, but he filed the thought away. Different how? She's usually in control, but since Michael got suspended, she's been tense, like she's waiting for something to happen. David gave a slow nod. He had already suspected Linda knew more than she was letting on. Now, he was certain of it. Emily sat at the office computer, flipping through purchase records. After her unexpected promotion, she had been granted access to more files than before. At first, she had simply wanted to learn the system, to understand how things worked from the inside. But the more she looked, the more something felt off. A particular set of invoices caught her eye. Orders for bulk food shipments marked as damaged upon arrival. But the quantities didn't make sense. Some days, the numbers spiked drastically without any pattern. Other times, they were abnormally low. She clicked deeper into the records. One supplier name kept appearing, Vanguard Supply. Her stomach tightened. She had heard that name before. Just as she was about to dig further, her screen flickered. A pop-up window appeared. Access denied. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. That was strange. She hadn't done anything outside the system's normal functions. She tried refreshing the page. Nothing. She clicked on a different file. A sinking feeling settled in her gut. Someone had locked the records. Someone knew she was looking. David sat in the conference room, facing members of the executive team through a thick air of unease. He had called this meeting to address the growing concerns over financial irregularities in the company. His goal had been simple, to push further, to demand answers. But the moment he started asking questions, he noticed something strange. Some of the executives were too quiet. Others looked at one another before speaking, as if measuring their words. A few outright deflected his questions. And then, without warning, his phone buzzed. He glanced down, irritation flickering in his chest, until he saw the notification. David Langston's reckless changes threatened company stability. Insiders revealed deep concerns over management shakeups. He tapped the link, and his blood ran cold. The article was already making rounds online. It painted him as impulsive, accused him of disrupting business with reckless decisions, suggested that his leadership had placed hundreds of employees at risk, fabricated numbers, twisted quotes, a clear attempt to undermine him. He looked up, scanning the faces around the table. The article had been carefully timed. It had been planted. This wasn't just about money. This wasn't just about Michael. Someone with real influence had just made their move. David sat at the head of the conference table, his expression unreadable as his public relations team shuffled into the room. The tension was thick. Everyone had seen the article, and no one needed to be told why they were here. Sarah Mitchell, head of corporate communications, set her laptop down and launched straight into it. The article came from an independent news site, not one of the major outlets. Normally, that wouldn't be an issue. But, she hesitated, then clicked a button on her screen, casting a social media analytics report onto the large monitor. David scanned the data. The article had been published barely 2 hours ago, yet it had already been shared thousands of times. Trending hashtags, comments accusing him of reckless leadership. Dozens of smaller blogs had picked it up, amplifying the claims. It's being pushed, Sarah said. Someone with influence made sure this didn't just fade into the background. David steepled his fingers. Have any reporters reached out? Yes, Sarah confirmed. And it's not just about the article. Some of them are digging deeper. Asking about Langston Dining's financials. Our hiring policies. Things completely unrelated. This isn't just damage control. Someone is preparing for a bigger hit. David exhaled through his nose. He had spent decades navigating corporate power plays. But this was different. It wasn't just about business, it was personal. Set up a press conference. He said finally, we're not playing defense. We're taking control of the narrative. Meanwhile, Emily sat in the dimly lit office, eyes fixed on the computer screen. She had spent hours combing through financial records, trying to find a pattern, anything that could explain why the system had been locked down the night before. Then, she saw it. Several older invoices had been altered, their original values overridden with lower numbers. The changes were subtle, but the timestamps told the story. Someone had adjusted these records after the fact. She pulled out her phone and dialed Jake. Meet me in the storage room, she said. I think I found something. Minutes later, they stood among stacks of archived paperwork, dust floating in the stale air. Jake rifled through a box, then pulled out a handful of crumpled receipts. These are the originals, he said. I kept copies before they started disappearing. Emily compared them to the digital records. On paper, the restaurant had received full shipments. But in the system, the amounts had been reduced. The missing food wasn't waste, it had been funneled elsewhere. Jake's face darkened. Whoever did this wasn't just making mistakes. They were covering their tracks. Emily nodded. And we need to make sure David sees this before it's too late. David stood at the podium, cameras flashing as reporters leaned in. He didn't wait for the first question. The claims made about me are false, he said firmly, and more importantly, they are a deliberate attempt to divert attention from something far more serious. He let the words settle, scanning the crowd. Langston Dining has been conducting an internal audit into potential financial misconduct. I can confirm that there is an active investigation into fraudulent activities that have affected not only this company but also the communities we serve. Murmurs spread through the audience. This wasn't the denial they had expected. David continued, I will not be intimidated by misinformation. The truth will come out, and those responsible will be held accountable. He stepped back, ignoring the reporters shouting for more. The damage had been reversed, at least for now. But he knew this wasn't over. Linda paced in her office, phone pressed to her ear. He's pushing too hard, she said, voice tense. If we don't act now, he'll uncover everything. A pause, a voice on the other end, low and unreadable. She clenched her jaw. Then we do it your way. That night, David returned home to find an envelope slipped under his door. Inside was a single photograph. His wife and daughter, taken earlier that day, walking down the street. Beneath it, a note. Stop now, or you'll regret it. David felt the weight of the warning settle over him. This wasn't just a business dispute anymore. Now, it was a war. David sat at his desk, staring at the photograph of his wife and daughter. The note beneath it was short, but its meaning was crystal clear. He had dealt with corporate threats before, hostile takeovers, smear campaigns, attempts to push him out of his own company. But this wasn't just business. This was personal. His first instinct was to call the police. But what would he even report? A vague threat with no clear suspect? By the time they took it seriously, whoever was behind this could be long gone. He needed to act fast. Reaching for his phone, he dialed a number he hadn't called in a long time. When the voice on the other end picked up, he spoke quickly. I need you to take Olivia and Rachel somewhere safe. Don't tell them why. Just do it. The voice hesitated. David, what's going on? Just do it, he said, then hung up before he could be questioned further. He sat back, exhaling slowly. His family would be safe. Now, it was time to deal with whoever thought they could intimidate him. Across town, Emily and Jake sat hunched over a laptop in the dimly lit office. Surrounded by stacks of old invoices and financial records, Emily scrolled through files with increasing frustration. This isn't just one location, she muttered. Whoever's behind this has been doing it across multiple branches. Jake frowned. How many? Emily leaned forward, her finger tracing the list. At least 10. Probably more. Jake rubbed the back of his neck. This isn't small-time fraud. This is organized. He reached into his bag, pulling out a folder he had taken from storage earlier that day. Inside was a copy of an old contract, one that had caught his eye during his shift. Look at this, he said, handing it to Emily. Vanguard Supply. Emily skimmed the contract. It was an agreement between Langston Dining and a logistics company she had never heard of. The terms were vague, the numbers oddly rounded. Why does it feel like this company barely exists? She asked. Jake nodded. Because it barely does. I tried looking it up earlier. No real website, no physical headquarters listed, just a generic address that leads to a warehouse in Jersey. Emily's stomach turned. This isn't just about cutting costs. Someone is funneling money through fake suppliers. They needed to tell David. David walked into the conference room where Linda sat reviewing reports. She looked up, her expression carefully neutral. David, she said, forcing a polite smile. What can I do for you? He didn't waste time. How long have you known about Vanguard Supply? A flicker of something, surprise, maybe even fear, crossed her face before she schooled her expression. I'm not sure what you mean, she said. David studied her. I think you are. She set down her pen. If you have concerns, I suggest we discuss them through the proper channels. That's exactly what we're doing, he said. And since we're discussing things, maybe you can explain why multiple locations have missing inventory tied to fake transactions? Her jaw tightened. I don't control supply chain logistics, but you oversee financial approvals. She exhaled slowly. You're making accusations without proof. David held her gaze. You're nervous. Linda, why? She hesitated for just a second too long. Unless, he continued, you're afraid of whoever's really pulling the strings. The silence stretched between them. Finally, she gathered her papers. If you'll excuse me, I have work to do. She walked past him without another word. David left the building and climbed into his car, his mind racing. The pieces were coming together, but not fast enough. As he pulled out of the parking lot, he caught sight of a dark sedan in his rearview mirror. It stayed behind him for 5 blocks. Then 10. He took an unexpected turn onto a crowded street, hoping to lose them. The car followed. David's pulse quickened. He made another turn, pulling into a cafe parking lot, where people gathered on the sidewalk. If they were planning something, they wouldn't do it in public. The other car stopped a few spaces away. A man stepped out, well-dressed, professional. He walked with purpose, his expression unreadable. David got out of his own car, meeting him halfway. The man spoke in a low voice. You're getting too close to something you don't understand. David's muscles tensed. Who sent you? The man smiled slightly. I'm just here to deliver a message. David crossed his arms. Then deliver it. The man's voice remained calm. If you want to live, walk away now. David held his ground. Or what? The man didn't answer. He simply turned and walked back to his car. David watched as the sedan pulled away, disappearing into traffic. He stood there for a long moment, heart pounding. Whoever was behind this wasn't just protecting money. They were willing to kill for it. David remained in his car for several minutes after the encounter, gripping the steering wheel as he processed the warning. The man in the suit had disappeared as quickly as he had arrived. But his words lingered. This wasn't just about financial corruption anymore. Someone powerful wanted this buried, and they were willing to escalate things beyond corporate maneuvering. He took a slow breath before starting the car and driving toward Langston Dining's headquarters. He had wasted enough time reacting. It was time to take control. The first step was security. When he arrived at the office, he called his chief of security, Mark Reynolds, a former federal investigator he had hired years ago. Mark wasn't just a security specialist, he knew how to spot patterns, how to anticipate threats before they escalated. I need a full review of our digital security, David told him. Check for any unauthorized access to our systems, particularly financial records, and keep an eye on incoming and outgoing communications. I don't want anything slipping past us. Mark gave him a sharp nod. Understood. I'll also have my team monitor any unusual activity around you, physical or digital. If someone's watching, we'll know. David wasn't taking any more chances. Emily sat at her desk, her heart pounding as she scrolled through old financial reports. The deeper she dug, the clearer the pattern became. Vanguard Supply wasn't just a logistics company, it was a front. Her fingers hovered over a name she had just uncovered. Horizon Capital, a private investment firm that specialized in acquisitions, restructurings, and, most notably, supply chain investments. One of its largest investors was listed as none other than Richard Vaughn, the chief financial officer of Langston Dining. Emily swallowed hard. If Richard was involved in Vanguard Supply, that meant the company's own leadership was profiting off the manipulated supply chain. She immediately called David. "I found something," she said the moment he picked up. "It's bigger than we thought." The next morning, David sat at the head of the executive boardroom table, the air thick with anticipation. Every senior leader in Langston Dining had been called to this emergency meeting, their expressions ranging from confusion to barely concealed irritation. Linda sat near the end of the table, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Richard Vaughn, the CFO, sat across from David, his expression carefully neutral. David took a deep breath before speaking. "I called this meeting because I have reason to believe there has been systematic fraud occurring within Langston Dining." A murmur spread across the table, some executives shifting uncomfortably in their seats. "Our investigation has uncovered financial discrepancies tied to a supplier, Vanguard Supply. This company has been funneling food products through a manipulated system, costing this company millions while benefiting a select few." Richard leaned back in his chair, tilting his head slightly. "That's quite a claim. David, do you have proof?" David met his gaze. "I do." He turned to Emily, who was seated to his right. She tapped on her laptop, casting financial reports onto the large screen in the room. The numbers spoke for themselves: altered invoices, unexplained discrepancies, and direct financial ties to Horizon Capital. Richard's expression didn't waver. Instead, he sighed and shook his head. "David, I think you need to consider what you're doing here." David narrowed his eyes. Richard folded his hands on the table. "You've spent the last few weeks disrupting business operations, making accusations, and causing unnecessary panic. Now, you're making claims that could shake investor confidence." A few board members shifted uncomfortably at the mention of investors. Richard leaned forward. "Have you considered that your recent decisions, the food donation program, the policy changes, are what's actually causing financial instability? Not fraud, not corruption, just bad leadership." It was a well-placed move. By shifting the blame to David's recent reforms, Richard was trying to make him look reckless. David let the silence hang for a moment. Then, he smiled. "I see what you're doing, Richard," he said calmly. "You want this to be about my leadership instead of your financial crimes." Richard chuckled, feigning amusement. "Financial crimes? That's a serious accusation." David leaned forward. "You have direct financial ties to Vanguard Supply. Horizon Capital has been benefiting from the manipulation of Langston Dining's supply chain. And you know it." Richard's smile faded for just a second. A flicker of something, annoyance, perhaps even concern, crossed his face. "You can't prove that," he said quietly. David met his gaze. "Not yet." The meeting ended in tense silence, with executives leaving the room in hushed conversations. As Richard exited, he walked past Linda, lowering his voice just enough for her to hear. "We need to act before he digs too deep." Linda didn't respond, but her fingers tightened around the pen she was holding. David sat in his office, replaying the board meeting in his mind. Richard Vaughn wasn't just a CFO, he was something far more dangerous. The way he had deflected questions, the way he had tried to turn the board against him. It was clear, Richard wasn't just aware of the corruption, he was orchestrating it. David leaned back, exhaling slowly. If he wanted to bring Richard down, he needed more than suspicions. He needed proof. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he rarely used. When the line connected, a deep voice answered. "It's been a while, David." David didn't waste time. "I need you to dig into financial records, quietly. Transactions linked to Vanguard Supply. Payments routed through secondary accounts. If there's a paper trail, I want it." There was a pause. "You think it's someone inside?" "I don't think," David said. "I know." Across the building, Emily and Jake were deep into their own investigation. Emily's fingers moved swiftly across the keyboard, bypassing the system's restricted access. She had spent the last few hours tracing transactions linked to Vanguard Supply, and something didn't add up. "Look at this," she murmured, tilting her screen toward Jake. Jake leaned in, his brow furrowing. Several large payments had been processed before Vanguard Supply had even been contracted. The money had been routed through multiple intermediary accounts before disappearing into untraceable destinations. "This isn't just fraud," Jake muttered. "It's money laundering." Emily nodded, her stomach tightening. "And whoever's behind it knew exactly how to cover their tracks." Jake hesitated before speaking. "I might have something else." He pulled out a flash drive and inserted it into the laptop. "A friend of mine used to work in accounting before he left last year. He saved copies of some financial reports, said things didn't sit right with him." A few clicks later, an old document appeared on the screen. Emily's eyes widened. Richard Vaughn's name was all over it. He had personally signed off on financial adjustments that allowed Vanguard Supply to receive inflated payments, well before the company had even begun operations. Jake let out a slow breath. "We just found our smoking gun." David stared at the screen, his mind racing. He had the proof, but if he confronted Richard now, the man would deny everything. Worse, he might try to destroy evidence or silence anyone who knew the truth. He needed a plan. He reached for his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the name he was looking for. Ethan Cole, a journalist with a reputation for exposing high-level corruption. He had taken down executives, politicians, entire corporations, and now, David needed him. He hit call. Ethan answered on the second ring. "David Langston, haven't heard from you in years. I have a story for you," David said, "and it's going to be big." Hours later, David was gathering his things when his phone buzzed. A new message. "No sender. Stop now, or next time, you won't get the chance to read this." David felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise. This wasn't just a warning. It was a promise. David walked into the boardroom with measured steps, his face unreadable. The tension in the air was palpable. Every senior executive of Langston Dining sat at the long oak table, their expressions carefully neutral, except for Richard Vaughn, who was seated at the far end, a knowing smirk playing at the corner of his lips. As soon as David took his seat, Richard cleared his throat and stood. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard began, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "Recent events have forced us to reassess our leadership and company stability. This morning, I received financial reports that raise serious concerns." David remained silent as Richard clicked a remote, casting documents onto the large presentation screen. His stomach twisted as he recognized what was happening. The reports displayed manipulated financial data, subtly altered to paint a picture of mismanagement under David's leadership. It suggested that the recent policy changes, particularly the food donation program, had created financial instability, leading to unnecessary losses. "As you can see," Richard continued, turning to the board, "these reckless decisions have disrupted our financial standing. Given the circumstances, I believe it is in the company's best interest to temporarily relieve David Langston of his position as CEO until a full review is conducted." Murmurs spread across the room. A few executives exchanged uneasy glances, but others nodded in agreement. David sat still, hands folded on the table. Linda was next to speak. "We must consider company stability," she said smoothly. "This isn't about personal grievances, it's about protecting Langston Dining." David had expected this. Richard had been waiting for the right moment to strike. And now, with fabricated financial reports and the board already uneasy from recent controversies, he was attempting to push David out before he could expose the real corruption. The room fell silent as Richard delivered the final blow. "I motion for an immediate vote to suspend David Langston from his duties as CEO." Across the building, Emily and Jake were working against the clock. Emily had spent the last 2 hours trying to access the digital financial records they had found the night before, but they were gone. Every trace of Vanguard Supply's fraudulent transactions had been wiped clean. Jake muttered a curse. "Someone locked us out." Emily clenched her jaw. "Not just locked us out. They erased everything." Jake shook his head. "That's not possible. Files don't just disappear." Emily turned to him. "Unless someone inside helped." She grabbed her phone and dialed David. It rang once, then went straight to voicemail. "Something's happening," she said. "We need to move faster." Jake exhaled. Then we better hope we find something they missed. Back in the boardroom, David finally spoke. I accept. The room fell silent. Richard blinked. Excuse me? David leaned forward, his voice steady. I accept the temporary suspension. Richard hesitated, sensing something off. Well, then. But, David interrupted, I have a condition. Richard's jaw tightened. What condition? David steepled his fingers. A full, independent audit of Langston Dining's financial records. If I'm to be removed over supposed mismanagement, then let's ensure the numbers are accurate. For the first time, Richard's confident expression faltered. A few executives nodded in agreement. A neutral audit sounded reasonable, fair, even. It would clear any doubt about the financial state of the company. Richard forced a smile. Of course, if that's what it takes to maintain trust. I have no objections. But David caught the flicker in Richard's eyes. He had no choice but to agree publicly, but privately. He would try to sabotage the audit. David stood. Then I look forward to seeing the results. He turned and walked out of the room, knowing he had just bought himself time. An hour later, David sat in his office, trying to formulate his next move. His phone buzzed. A blocked number. He answered. A voice, distorted and disguised. Check your inbox. The call disconnected. David hesitated before opening his email. A new message sat in his inbox, containing only one attachment, a video file. He clicked play. The screen filled with an Excel spreadsheet, financial records, identical to the ones that had been erased. But this time, they contained something new. A name. Stonebridge Holdings. David's breath caught. Stonebridge Holdings was no ordinary firm. It was a powerful private equity giant, known for ruthless acquisitions and opaque financial dealings. And now, he had proof they were pulling the strings behind Vanguard Supply. This was no longer just a company scandal. This was an empire built on corruption. David sat in his dimly lit office, the only source of light coming from his laptop screen. The USB drive rested in his hand, deceptively small for something that could bring down giants. He inserted it into his computer and watched as the files unfolded in front of him. Line after line of transaction records, wire transfers, and contract agreements. The deeper he dug, the clearer the picture became. Richard Vaughn hadn't just been embezzling money, he had been orchestrating a sophisticated laundering operation. Millions of dollars had moved from Langston Dining into Vanguard Supply before being siphoned through a network of shell companies. Then came the final connection. Briggs Financial Group. David's breath hitched as he recognized the name. Briggs wasn't just another financial firm, it was a behemoth. A shadow entity known for manipulating markets, dismantling companies, and funding high-level political campaigns. If Briggs was involved, this went beyond corporate fraud. This was systemic corruption at the highest levels. David leaned back, rubbing his temples. He wasn't just up against Richard anymore. He was up against an entire machine. He needed help. That night, he met Sarah Klein at a small, unassuming diner on the outskirts of the city. The investigative journalist was known for uncovering some of the biggest financial scandals in modern history. She didn't work for mainstream media, she worked for the truth. Sarah sipped her coffee, watching David carefully. You wouldn't call me unless it was big. David slid the USB across the table. It's big. She plugged it into her laptop, scrolling through the files. Her eyes narrowed, then widened as she reached the final set of transactions. This is beyond anything I expected. She looked up, lowering her voice. You realize what happens if this goes public, right? Briggs Financial doesn't just play defense. They eliminate threats. David exhaled. That's why I need your help. I need this information to be airtight. I need it to be undeniable. Sarah tapped her fingers against the table, thinking, I'll coordinate with my legal team. Make sure this gets handled the right way. But David, once this is out, there's no going back. I know, he said, but they already came for me. I won't let them win. Meanwhile, across town, Emily and Jake worked late into the night. Emily scrolled through old digital archives, her frustration mounting. Something's missing. Jake rubbed his eyes. We've found more than enough to expose Richard. Emily shook her head. No, this isn't just about Richard. If we don't get ahead of this, they'll find a way to bury David before he can fight back. Then, she found it. A hidden file buried deep in the company's internal records. Emily clicked it open. A contract popped up on her screen, one that had never been filed publicly. She gasped. Richard had been preparing to pin the entire financial mismanagement on David. The document outlined unauthorized changes to the company's food supply policies, falsely attributing the fraud to him. It was a setup, carefully planted to make David the scapegoat. They're planning to charge him, Emily whispered. Jake's face hardened. Then we need to move faster. David was in his office when his phone buzzed. A number he didn't recognize. A deep voice spoke calmly. You need to stop. David's grip tightened. Who is this? The voice ignored him. If you continue, your family won't be safe. His blood ran cold. Where are they? A video appeared on his phone. His wife and daughter, walking outside a small cafe. Their supposed safe house. A dark car idled nearby. Too close. Too slow. David stood frozen, fists clenched. You have a choice. The voice continued. Walk away. Forget about this. The call ended. David stared at the screen. Heart pounding. Briggs Financial had just made their move. David gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white as the black SUV idled in front of him, blocking his path. He glanced in the rearview mirror. Another vehicle had pulled up behind him, sealing off any escape. The city streets, usually bustling at this hour, seemed eerily empty. A man stepped out of the SUV. He was tall, dressed in an immaculate suit, his expression unreadable. David's pulse quickened. He had expected retaliation, but not this fast. The man approached, stopping just outside David's driver's side window. He leaned down slightly, his voice calm but firm. Get in. David hesitated. He was alone. No security. No backup. He could refuse. But what then? A public confrontation on the street wouldn't end well. If these men wanted to make him disappear, they would have done it already. He exhaled slowly, then opened the door. Meanwhile, across the city, Emily and Jake worked in near silence, their fingers flying across their keyboards. Jake wiped sweat from his brow. Are you sure this will work? Emily didn't look up. It has to. They had spent the last several hours creating an elaborate digital decoy, a set of altered financial records designed to look like the real evidence but with intentional discrepancies. If Richard or anyone else accessed them, it would trigger an internal tracking system. The real files, meanwhile, were already en route to a federal prosecutor, one with a long-standing grudge against Briggs Financial. Jake let out a breath. If they fall for it, we might just buy David enough time. Emily's jaw tightened. We better. David sat in the back of the SUV. The windows tinted so dark he could barely make out the passing city lights. The man in the suit sat across from him, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp. You've been very busy, Mr. Langston, the man said, digging where you shouldn't, speaking to people you shouldn't. David folded his arms. I don't scare easily. The man smirked. That's unfortunate. The SUV came to a smooth stop outside a sleek, high-rise office building. The door opened, and David was ushered inside. The room they entered was cold, sterile. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city skyline, and in the center of the room stood a man David had only seen in photographs. Graham Whitmore, CEO of Briggs Financial Group, the real puppet master. Whitmore turned from the window, a faint smile on his lips. David Langston, you've been making quite a mess. David remained silent. Whitmore gestured toward a chair. Sit. David didn't move. I prefer to stand. Whitmore chuckled. Very well. Then let's get to the point. You have something I want. And I have something you care about. David's phone buzzed. A message. A live feed of his wife and daughter. A man in a dark coat watching them from a distance. David's stomach twisted. Whitmore's voice remained pleasant. You release the files, and your family remains safe. You continue down this path. He gestured at the screen. And accidents happen. David's mind raced. He had anticipated this, but seeing it play out in real time was different. Whitmore leaned in slightly. You have 1 hour. David met his gaze. And if I refuse? Whitmore smiled. Then you'll find out just how far we're willing to go. David stepped out of the SUV, his senses sharpened by the overwhelming silence of the underground parking garage. The air smelled of freshly polished concrete and cold metal. The men who had escorted him, silent, efficient, and undoubtedly trained, led him to a private elevator. No buttons, no control panel, just a keycard scan before the doors slid shut. As the elevator ascended, David adjusted his cuff, masking the growing tension in his chest. He had spent years negotiating with powerful businessmen. But this was different. This wasn't a boardroom dispute over market shares. This was about survival. The doors opened to a spacious, glass-walled conference room, perched high above Manhattan's skyline. The city sprawled beneath them, its lights flickering against the dark horizon. Sitting at the far end of a sleek, obsidian table was a man David recognized immediately. Jonathan Briggs, CEO of Briggs Financial Group, the real orchestrator of everything. Jonathan was in his mid-50s, dressed in an impeccable dark suit, a subtle smirk playing at his lips. He radiated a kind of power that didn't require theatrics, his mere presence commanded control. "Mr. Langston," Jonathan greeted, gesturing to the chair opposite him. "I appreciate your punctuality." David didn't sit. "Let's skip the pleasantries." Jonathan chuckled, as if amused by David's defiance. "I respect a man who values time. So, I'll be direct." He leaned back, folding his hands neatly on the table. "You've been quite the disruption, David, digging where you shouldn't, exposing things better left unseen." He nodded toward the window. "Tell me, do you really think you can change how the world works?" David remained silent, watching him. Jonathan continued, his tone calm but edged with something darker. "You see, men like you are rare. Men who still believe in integrity, in justice." He exhaled, almost regretfully. "But the world doesn't run on justice. It runs on control, and I control it." David tilted his head. "Then why am I here? If you have so much control, why haven't you just had me removed?" Jonathan's smirk widened. "Because I admire intelligence, and I don't destroy things I can use." He slid a small black folder across the table. "Inside that," he said, "as a way out, a quiet exit, a substantial financial package, enough to ensure that you, your family, and even your grandchildren never have to worry about anything again." He met David's eyes. "All I ask in return is that you walk away. Forget this ever happened." David didn't glance at the folder. He already knew what was inside, wealth beyond measure, designed to buy his silence. Jonathan studied him. "You're thinking this is some sort of admission of guilt." He shook his head. "It's not. This is just how things work. Power doesn't belong to the righteous. It belongs to those willing to wield it." David's voice was steady. "And if I refuse?" Jonathan's smile faded, just slightly. "Then I will dismantle everything you love." He gestured toward the city lights. "Your family, your company, your legacy, all of it, erased. Piece by piece." He leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "And I will do it so thoroughly that history itself will forget you ever existed." A long silence stretched between them. David inhaled, then exhaled slowly. "If you weren't afraid of me, you wouldn't be offering me a way out." Jonathan chuckled again, but this time, it lacked amusement. "A fair observation." He stood, straightening his suit. "But confidence and recklessness are two very different things. You have 24 hours to decide. Walk away, or be buried under the weight of a war you cannot win." David didn't respond. He turned and walked toward the elevator, feeling the eyes of Jonathan's men on him. As he stepped inside, his phone vibrated in his pocket. He pulled it out, glancing at the message. "We have a backup. Proceed." It was from Emily and Jake. David's jaw tightened. Jonathan thought he held all the cards. He was wrong. David stepped into the crisp morning air, the weight of the past few weeks still lingering in his chest. The city was waking up, oblivious to the storm that had just passed, one that had shaken the very foundation of corporate greed. He took a deep breath, knowing that this was only the beginning of a much larger ripple effect. Within hours of the leaked financial records, media outlets exploded with headlines exposing the corruption inside Briggs Financial Group. News anchors dissected the transactions, connecting the dots between Richard Vaughan, Vanguard Supply, and the offshore accounts that funneled millions into hidden vaults. By midday, the FBI had executed an arrest warrant for Richard Vaughan. Cameras captured him being led out of his penthouse, handcuffed and stone-faced. The charges were severe: wire fraud, conspiracy, and money laundering. The fallout didn't stop there. Jonathan Briggs was summoned before a congressional committee. Under the blinding lights of national television, he faced relentless questioning about his role in the financial manipulation. He denied everything at first, but the weight of the evidence was undeniable. The committee called for a full-scale federal investigation into Briggs' financial group, freezing assets and halting major transactions. Linda, once the gatekeeper of Vaughn's operations, found herself cornered. Internal audits exposed her role in enforcing policies that allowed the fraud to continue unchecked. She was dismissed immediately, her reputation in shambles. Meanwhile, at Langston Dining, real change was taking shape. Emily, whose integrity had started this entire battle, was officially promoted to branch manager. Under her leadership, the restaurant implemented a new community initiative. Excess food was now donated to shelters, ensuring that no one would be turned away hungry. Jake, the quiet but persistent truth seeker, accepted a permanent position overseeing supply chain transparency. His efforts had been instrumental in uncovering the fraud, and David made sure his contributions were not overlooked. But for David, the fight had taken its toll. At a press conference, he addressed the public one final time as CEO. "This company was built on trust, and I refuse to let that trust be destroyed. Today, I am stepping down, knowing that the right people are now in place to lead Langston Dining forward." A hush fell over the room before the reporters erupted into questions. But David had already made his decision. He had fought the battle he needed to fight. Now, it was time to walk away. That evening, as he packed his belongings, a small envelope was slipped under his door. No return address, no markings, just a single folded piece of paper inside. "You won this round, but the game is far from over. The system remains." David read the words twice before leaning back in his chair, exhaling slowly. He wasn't surprised. There would always be another battle, another shadow lurking behind power. But for now, he had done what was right, and that was enough. Sometimes, the smallest act of kindness can spark the biggest change. Emily didn't help that veteran for recognition. She did it because it was the right thing to do. But her actions set off a chain reaction that exposed greed, corruption, and ultimately, justice. So, what would you do if no one was watching, or if the right person was? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to Undercover Truths for more eye-opening stories like this one.